BP added more than $70 billion to the U.S. economy in 2022. Investments like acquiring America's largest biogas producer, Archaea Energy, and starting up new infrastructure in the Gulf of Mexico. It's and, not or. See what doing both means for energy nationwide at bp.com/investing in America.
Have you heard? You can listen to your gripping investigations ad-free. Good news. With Amazon Music, you have access to the largest catalog of ad-free top podcasts included with your Prime membership. To start listening, download the Amazon Music app or visit amazon.com/truecrime ad-free. That's amazon.com/truecrime ad-free. And catch up on the latest episodes without the ads.
Content warning. This episode contains discussion of murder.
We've all heard the phrase garbage in, garbage out. It means that if you input flawed or garbage data, then you are going to get a flawed or garbage result. Generally, the phrase is used in computer science, but it also applies in the criminal court system.
When juries hear junk evidence or analysis from experts who truly don't know what they are talking about, then the end result may be a wrongful conviction. Journalist Radley Balko believes that is a major problem today. He and Tucker Carrington wrote The Cadaver King and the Country Dentist, a book which highlights how two so-called expert witnesses may be responsible for a slew of wrongful convictions.
We were pleased when Radley agreed to talk with us about his work and the problem of wrongful convictions. My name is Anya Kane. I'm a journalist.
And I'm Kevin Greenlee. I'm an attorney.
And this is The Murder Sheet.
We're a true crime podcast focused on original reporting, interviews, and deep dives into murder cases.
We're The Murder Sheet.
And this is a conversation with Radley Balko about the Cadaver King and wrongful convictions.
I want to jump into the Cadaver King and the Country Dentist, if that's okay. And you start off, such a stark first line. It is relatively easy to convict an innocent person from the foreword by John Grisham. And I'm curious, why do you think that is? What factors make it difficult to identify and help a wrongfully convicted person?
Well, I think there are two issues here. The first is the ability to convict an innocent person. And I think the reason why it's relatively easy is that we put so much faith in the kind of trust, and we put too much faith and trust in the judgment and wisdom of police and prosecutors. And this isn't to say that, all police and prosecutors are bad people or they're trying to put innocent people in prison. It's to say that they're human, and they suffer from the same. And this is also true of crime lab analysts, right? We are all subject to bias. We are all subject to tunnel vision. We are all subject to, trying to take shortcuts on our job every now and then. And so, but we kind of treat these positions, particularly district attorneys and, detectives and police officers, as if they're almost infallible, right? We put an enormous amount of weight and consideration into the decisions that they make. And so, what happens is a conscientious police officer who wants to do the right thing and wants to get the right person will focus on a suspect and will sort of hone in on a suspect and then get what we call tunnel vision. And so now, instead of collecting all the evidence and seeing where that evidence leads, what they tend to do is decide, whether it's a hunch or they just don't like somebody, they'll decide that genuinely and sincerely decide that this person is probably the person who did it. And instead of just sort of collecting all the evidence and following our leads, they now start looking for evidence that will implicate that person. And we see this over and over again. So then what happens? Well, as our book documents in Mississippi, you first take the body to a medical examiner for an autopsy, right? Well, in Mississippi, you had this really twisted system with perverse incentives where whenever there was a suspicious death, the prosecutor and the coroner got together and they contracted the autopsy out to a private medical examiner. Well, what happens then is that these private medical examiners are in a position where their judgment is going to be biased in favor of the people who are hiring them to do the autopsy. So if a prosecutor comes to me and says, here's the body, here's what I think happened, here's the guy who did it, and we know these conversations happen. In fact, we know that police and prosecutors are often present at these autopsies. If I'm a conscientious medical examiner and I come back and say, well, sorry, that's not what happened, or more likely, sorry, but there's just not enough evidence for me to say that that's what happened, either way, they might not hire me next time they need to shop out an autopsy. And so what happened, and what we document in the book, is this guy, Stephen Hain, was able to basically monopolize the autopsy business, for lack of a better term, in Mississippi by telling prosecutors what they wanted to hear. And when other doctors would, in fact, one former prosecutor flat out told me when we were researching the book, he says, everybody knows that if you don't get the results you want from an autopsy, you can always take the body to Stephen Hain. And so you have this system where they're going to get the autopsy results that they want. Well, now, what else would help shore up your case? Well, a jailhouse informant would be great. Somebody who can say that the defendant admitted to them that they committed this crime. And, truth be told, I really have my doubts that people are confessing to their crimes to people they just met in jail in a holding cell with nearly the frequency that it apparently, police claim to say it happened. But, again, you have twisted incentives. So if you're somebody in one of these cells facing your own drug charges or, something even more serious, and the police come to you and say, hey, if you can get this guy to confess, we'll knock 10 years off your sentence, or we'll release you, or we'll, knock it down a couple of levels, classes of felony. And, the police might be being entirely sincere. They probably think this person really did it. And maybe they're just telling this informant to chat with the person. And if they can confess, great. But from the perspective of the informant, it's like, well, if I can get this person to confess or just say they confessed, I'm going to get 10 years knocked off of my sentence. Well, then, of course, I'm going to get them to confess, whether they actually do or not. And so basically you have this system where nobody's really sort of checking or scrutinizing these hunches of police officers. And you can very quickly build a very substantive seeming case. You've got testimony from a medical examiner now. Now you've got testimony from an informant who claims there was a confession. The Reed technique, which is the interrogation technique that most police departments around the country use, is notorious for producing false confessions. You can even get your actual suspect to confess. And now you have a really formidable case, and it doesn't really matter that there's no sort of solid ground beneath it. You have enough to convince a jury. And that's at the conviction stage. Once you get convicted, as I mentioned before, the system now puts a premium on finality. The system just does not want to admit that it makes mistakes. And so unless your case has DNA that wasn't tested, which, in all likelihood doesn't really happen anymore. Now, if there's DNA, it does get tested pretty early on. You don't really have much hope once you've been convicted. The system makes it extremely difficult, particularly once you've exhausted your appeals. There's this horrible irony in our system where once you've exhausted your appeals, your case enters a phase called post-conviction. And this is the phase where you're most likely to get access to the prosecutor's file. It's where you're most likely to find the kinds of violations that lead to wrongful conviction. Unfortunately, it's also the stage when courts are least likely to reopen your case and let you back into court. So, you've got these kind of incentive problems pre-conviction that kind of let police and prosecutors do whatever they want without much scrutiny. And then post-conviction, you've got this system that kind of cements what police and prosecutors did under this principle of finality, which makes it, really, really difficult to get anyone to look at your case again.
You mentioned Stephen Hain. I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about not just him, but also about Michael West and the roles they both played in the court system.
Yeah. So Stephen Hayne, as I mentioned, he was able to kind of monopolize these autopsy referrals in Mississippi over the course of 20 years, about 20 years. He did somewhere between 85 and 90% of the autopsies in criminal cases in the state. Plus, he also worked in Louisiana, some, Alabama, Tennessee, and also did civil cases. According to the National Association of Medical Examiners, which is kind of the premier professional group for forensic pathologists, a medical examiner should do no more than 250 autopsies per year. At most, they say 325. If you do more than that, they won't give your lab accreditation. So 325 is the absolute max, they say. Hayne, for most of his career, was doing at least 1,200 autopsies per year. In his prime, it was somewhere between 1,500 and 1,800, and there were a couple of years when he did over 2,000. If you do the math, divide that by 365 days a year, and you can see why the idea that he was doing all these autopsies and with any sort of, quality control, it defies any credulity. Not to mention that at the same time, he was testifying in court 4 or 5 times a week all over the state. So he's this kind of autopsy, assembly line, basically. Hayne was slick. He was very smart. And so he was very good on the stand. He was able to kind of keep defense attorneys running in circles by, he would claim various accreditations from these groups that sound like the official accrediting groups for medical examiners, but actually are sort of online or kind of diploma mill type places where you just pay a fee and they send you an accreditation. And unfortunately, defense attorneys and judges and juries didn't really know the difference. And so he was able to kind of claim, these credentials that he didn't really have. In fact, he took the official accrediting test from the American Board of Pathologists and failed it and walked out about 3/4 of the way through. But it took 20 years for him to finally be called out on that. He told prosecutors what they wanted to hear. And a lot of times, the person probably was guilty anyway. A lot of times what he said probably wasn't beyond the realm of legitimate science. But he was willing to say some pretty absurd things when he had to. So the example I always give is there was a case of a kid named Tyler Edmonds who was arrested when he was 13 years old for killing his sister's husband. And according to the prosecution's theory, they both wanted to kill the husband, but neither had the guts to do it themselves. So Tyler and his sister waited until his sister's husband was asleep, and they held the gun together and fired the trigger simultaneously, but they both fired the trigger at the same time. Well, that may or may not have been true. Who knows? But Hayne got on the witness stand and told the jury that he could tell by the bullet wounds in the body that there were 2 hands on the gun that fired the bullet, which is just absolutely absurd, right? It's like saying you can tell the color of a killer's eyes by the knife wounds, in the body. And yet that was upheld by a judge. Again, this is another problem with having judges be the gatekeepers of good and bad science in the courtroom. The judge, not only when the defense asked for a hearing on the scientific, legitimacy of what Hayne had said about the 2 hands on the gun theory, and the judge wouldn't even grant a hearing. Then Tyler Edmonds had confessed. He's 13. The interrogation had all the red flags of a false confession. And the defense wanted to put up an expert on false confession. And this time the prosecution objected. And the judge not only granted a hearing, he ruled for the state, and the defense was not allowed to put a expert on false confessions on the stand because the judge said there was no scientific validity for that. And we now, of course, know that false confessions are common. There are multiple studies showing that they're, particularly when you use this Reed technique of interrogation.
Here at the Murder Sheet, we work on the podcast and our investigative reporting full time. That means we sometimes don't have time to meticulously plan and cook delicious and nutritious meals. So, in this new year, we are eternally grateful to our sponsor, Factor.
Now's a great time to try out ready-to-eat meal delivery service Factor. Remember, when you support our great sponsors like Factor, you're supporting us and our ability to keep doing this work. So please consider visiting factormeals.com/msheet50 and use code msheet50 to get 50% off.
Factor allows you to pop your ready-made meal into the microwave. In 2 minutes flat, you'll have a hot and ready dish with minimal cleanup afterward. It's just that simple.
Also, this food is awesome. I recently dug their black bean and rice enchilada bowl with roasted zucchini, corn, and salsa verde. It tasted so fresh and flavorful.
I love that we get to skip meal prep, the grocery stores, expensive to-go orders, and elaborate cleanup. Plus, there's plenty of options for extra picky eaters like me.
We've really been thrilled with Factor, and we feel you will be too if you're striving to eat healthy and save time in 2024. It's really helped me meet my nutritional goals for the new year.
Head to factormeals.com/msheet50 and use code msheet50 to get 50% off. That's code msheet50 at factormeals.com/msheet50 to get 50% off.
So Hain, again, he was able to dominate the system by telling prosecutors what they wanted to hear. He's willing to testify in court and say just about anything. But again, Hain was, he was smart. He could read a room. He was a very good he had a very good ability to read people. He could talk his way out of just about, any sort of jam he got into on the witness stand. His sidekick is a different story. His sidekick was this guy, Michael West. West was rogue. He was brash. He was extremely confident in his abilities, despite the fact they were just complete and utter bullshit. So West kind of made his name as a bite mark expert. He claimed he could find bites on human skin that no other person could see by using this technique where he would put on these yellow goggles and shine fluorescent light on the body. And he said, this would enable him to see bites that had been inflicted months earlier. He modestly called this technique the West phenomenon. He won over juries by sort of painting himself as just this small-time dentist who, had this gift and was just trying to do good and put the bad guys away. And that would often contrast defense witnesses who, were flown in from New York or Miami or California who could be portrayed as kind of hired guns. But West was he was a quack. There was nothing to what he claimed, and the fact that he repeatedly would match bite marks to the wrong person and put multiple innocent people in prison also allowed lots of guilty people to remain free, several of which went on to commit other murders. He, at one point, one of my favorite West examples was a guy that there was a triple homicide in Louisiana. These three people were stabbed to death, and the state had their hunch on who they thought it was, and they hired West to basically to try to match the knife to the knife wounds in the body of this knife that they thought was a murder weapon. And, that's already pretty suspect to say that only one knife could have created these wounds. But West was more than willing to do that. But then he went even further and gave them even more. So he went down to the jail, the suspect was being held, and did the West phenomenon on this guy's hands and claimed to have found marks on this guy's hands that could only have been caused by gripping this one particular knife and stabbing people with it. That's the only thing that could have caused these marks. Now, nobody else had seen these marks. West claimed he could only see them using his technique. He also claimed conveniently that the photos he took of the marks he had overdeveloped them, and so they were ruined. So he went back to the jail and photographed this guy's hand and drew in the marks that he had found from memory. And this was admitted into court. The guy was I think he was held for about 4 years before finally a Louisiana appeals court threw out West's testimony and the guy had to be released. However, that should have been the end of West's career. That was such a preposterous thing to claim, and to claim it to put somebody in prison for murder, for a triple homicide, that he should have never been anywhere near a courtroom again. Instead, this was at the beginning of his career, and he would go on to testify hundreds of times in courtrooms, not just in Louisiana and Mississippi, but all over the country. So Hain and West kind of worked together. West helped out Hain with his autopsy machine. Hain gave West some credibility in exchange for getting West's help, and so they kind of dominated the death investigation system in Mississippi for a really long time. And we know of so far, I believe, 5 people that they helped convict of murder have been exonerated and released. There's another guy, Jimmy Duncan, on death row in Louisiana, who also should be released. There's I think of at least 4 or 5 people currently in prison in Mississippi that we know of who should be released, who haven't been. But also, the other thing is it wasn't just that they would help prosecutors get their guy in these cases. A lot of times, prosecutors want to close. They don't want an open murder case. And if police and prosecutors deem somebody's life insignificant enough that they don't want to have another open murder case, if they can find a medical examiner who's willing to say that this was a natural death or an accident, that helps them clear those cases, and they don't have to, they don't have these open investigations anymore. And Hain was very useful for that too. I wrote about one case where this woman was found in her house with blood all over the wall, and a neighbor had seen a man running out of the house clutching a bloody rag or bloody shirt. And this was a impoverished black woman in rural Mississippi, and they took the body to Hain, and Hain determined that she had died of a stroke. So you can see how these guys could wreak havoc on the criminal justice. It's not just in terms of convicting the wrong people, but also for allowing actual crimes to go uninvestigated.
Do you believe
Very long answer.
Oh yeah, no, we love your long answers because they're in depth and rich with detail. So yeah, we appreciate that. I'm curious, do you believe that Hain or West knowingly gave false evidence, or does intent even matter in situations like this?
It's difficult to say because, I think at some point West had to realize that what he was saying was, complete and utter bullshit. In fact, there are times toward the kind of end of his career where he kind of just denounced bite mark testimony entirely, but then later he would say, well, I denounce everybody except my own. It's hard to say. I think West really thought very, very highly. Actually, they both did, in different ways. Hain sort of feigned humility and tried kind of just present him as a quiet, thoughtful, expert. I don't think he thought that he could tell by the bullet wounds that there were 2 hands on the gun that fired the bullets. I do think he thought the state had the right guy, and he probably thought that's how the murder happened. And so it's hard to say. You have to kind of dig into their motivations. West, I think, really believed his own bullshit. I think he really thought that he was this kind of genius. And, a lot of people are complicit in this. You have the coroners, which is an elected position in Mississippi, which is not a doctor political position, who enabled these guys. You got the prosecutors who enabled them. You have the defense bar who not only sort of didn't do a very good job cross-examining these guys, but also used them. So in Mississippi, most parts of Mississippi, the public defender is not a full-time position. So these people have private practices. And in the private practices, they take on civil cases, wrongful death cases, for example, and they would use Hain in their civil cases. So if you're using this guy in the cases where you actually make the bulk of your living, you're not going to be as aggressive with them in the criminal cases because you need their help in these other ones. So, it was Hain really kind of brilliantly positioned himself as the only game in town in Mississippi if you needed an autopsy done. And so that allowed him to kind of play all sides. And really the only, people who had the power, any of the people who had the power to do anything about him had a vested interest in him staying in that position. The only people who were really getting screwed over were people who didn't have the power to do anything about it.
What happened to these guys in the end, to West and to Hain?
Nothing. So Hain sued the Innocence Project because they filed a complaint against him with the state medical board and tried to get his license revoked. And in doing so, they arguably may have violated a privacy law that basically says when you challenge somebody's medical license, it's not public information, and they had released their report publicly. And they ended up settling with Hain for $100,000. I think it was $100,000, which, isn't very much money at all. I think what happened was their insurance said, all right, well, if we can make this go away for less than the cost of litigating it, we need to do that. Unfortunately, it allowed Hain to sort of declare victory. Hain also threatened to sue me multiple times. He never did, as did West. Never any criminal liability for either of them. The 2 cases that kind of drive our book, the narrative of the book, Kennedy Brewer and Levon Brooks, both tried to sue Hain and West in federal court for civil rights violations. Federal court found that Hain and West showed extreme negligence or egregious negligence. I don't know, some extreme form of negligence. But in order to win a civil suit against expert witnesses, so they're protected by this doctrine of qualified immunity. So you have to show negligence isn't enough. You have to show that they intentionally violated your rights. So you basically have to get them on tape saying, I am going to manufacture evidence against this person. And so the federal courts ruled that Brooks and Brewer did not meet that burden. Both were in prison for somewhere between 15 and 20 years. Kennedy Brewer was almost executed on multiple occasions, but they did not get their day in court. Hayne was eventually, after I did a bunch of investigative pieces, Hayne was fired from doing any more autopsies for prosecutors in Mississippi. He then started testifying for the defense in a few cases, which was really interesting. West was kind of dropped entirely. He became really toxic just because he was so arrogant and cocky and full of himself that he ended up shooting himself in the foot a number of times. But there was never really any consequences for either of them, other than there was some damage to their reputations. But Hayne died in the summer of 2020. Interestingly, there was this is a guy who was the state medical examiner for a while, did 85 to 90% of the autopsies for 20 years, testified in thousands of cases, and who, was a very prominent figure. I mean, for a medical examiner, he was very well known. There's no coverage of his death anywhere. You can't even find a funeral notice for him. The Jackson paper, which, he's been in hundreds of times over the years, his name has appeared in that paper in various articles, didn't cover him. None of the local news stations covered it. I found it really interesting. I don't really have information as to why, but I found it took me 2 months after he died to confirm it, and that was only because he was supposed to be deposed in several cases, and finally his attorney told the opposing counsel in those cases that he had actually died. West is still alive. Last I heard, he was the dentist at a prison in southern Mississippi, which is also really perverse and weird. I mean, given that he probably put some of those people in there, but he may be retired at this point. He's not in great health either at this point. But yeah, there's really been no comeuppance, no real consequences for them. And of course, as I mentioned, there are still, probably a dozen or so people of whom I would be confident in saying are innocent or should not be in prison. But these guys also testified in thousands of cases, so we have no idea how much damage they did. The only people, who are really looking into this are the attorneys at the Mississippi Innocence Project, and they have, I think a staff of 2 or 3. So there's no way they can really get to all of them. But, we had, I would say at least a dozen that I know of, and, who knows how many.
In your view, how big of a problem does junk science continue to be in the court system? I know we touched upon that earlier, but I also want to ask sort of a follow-up. What can we as a society do to curb this phenomenon?
I mean, I think it's a massive and pervasive problem. I mean, any shooting case is probably going to have a forensic firearms expert in it. And, I just don't think there's enough science to support, what they try to tell juries. But so many of these fields are corrupted, I should say. Blood spatter, Pam Koloff, of ProPublica, the New York Times Magazine, has done a lot on this. I mean, there's just no science to back up blood spatter analysis, and this idea that you can tell from blood spatter, how a crime was committed. Hayne also dabbled in that too. A shoe print stuff, you can tell from a shoe print maybe the size of the shoe, and in some cases, if it's a really good print, maybe the brand. But there's experts out there claiming that they can tell from shoe prints, how tall a person was or what kind of gait they had, if they were right or left-handed. And there's just there's no science to support that. And then we're also now getting, new fields where these new fields of forensics that are also just as dubious. I think it was ProPublica had another report on this 911 sort of call analysis where, they claim that they can tell by the diction and sort of the emotion and the way that the 911 caller talks to the operator, whether they may have committed, whatever act they're calling 911 about. I mean, we just have to have good kind of bullshit detectors. And I found that most of these fields that seem pretty dubious, when you look into them, there's just no science to back them up. Now, that doesn't mean that, that there aren't ever going to be new fields of forensics. So as I mentioned in my on ballistics, there are teams right now that are looking at this 3D imaging of bullets, and so they're scanning bullets 3D and then putting these images in computers and using algorithms to look at these tiny marks on bullets. But the important thing is these researchers aren't going into this saying we are going to create an algorithm that can identify a bullet and match it to a gun. They're going into it saying, is this even possible? Well, let's do what we can. Let's create a huge database. Let's put all these images in here and let's see, and then let's test ourselves and let's see how good we are at this and how accurate we are, what the margin for error is. And that, even skeptics I've talked to said that area of research is promising, and maybe we will, one day get to the point where we can use computers and algorithms to match a bullet to a gun and provide a margin for error the way we can for DNA. But we're just not there yet. I'll tell you one of the really overwhelming parts of this beat, and I love my job. It's very rewarding and fulfilling. It can be a little heavy sometimes, but one of the really overwhelming parts of it is when you're researching some case from the 80s or 90s, some wrongful conviction case, and you find this little thread where maybe there was a blood spatter expert who testified who, was only certified as an expert because they'd taken a 12-hour class on blood spatter. Or you find somebody like Hain, or you find a cop who was weirdly good at extracting confessions, and a couple of those confessions later turned out to be false confessions. So you find a little thread like that and you start pulling at it, right? And so you type that person's name into Lexis and you try to find other cases where they testified, and all of a sudden you find hundreds of the cases where that person testified. And then you find out that person, let's say the blood spatter expert, taught a class on blood spatter experts and then certified hundreds of other blood spatter experts who then went and testified in who knows how many cases. It becomes really overwhelming when you start to think, particularly when you go back to the 80s and 90s and a lot of these cases where people didn't have adequate defense counsel, where, we were in an era that prior to DNA, where we still just assumed the courts were always got it right. All of a sudden you're looking at hundreds or even thousands or even tens of thousands of cases corrupted, and you got there just by looking at this one case and pulling out a couple of threads, right? And then you start thinking, well, this is one case I was looking at and I found all of this. Imagine what else is out there. And you just start to wonder the sheer kind of volume of the injustices that must have been perpetrated in that era that we probably will never know about with the bulk of them. It can really be overwhelming sometimes. And that, not to say that everything's perfect now and we don't have wrongful convictions now, but I just sometimes think about all the innocent people who may be languishing because they were convicted at the age, the 80s and 90s, where, junk science flourished, where we had this really kind of punitive view of the criminal justice system, and where we just never thought that it could possibly be wrong. And it can be pretty depressing when you start to contemplate it all.
Yeah, it really and truly can. We really appreciate you talking with us. Before we wrap up, is there anything about the book or the things we've been discussing in this part of our conversation that we didn't mention that you wanted to address?
No, if you could just mention that, I'm an independent journalist now. So I make my living entirely, even though I make everything I write on my Substack free, I make my living almost entirely off of subscriptions from people who want to support my work. So if you're intrigued by this, or you think this work is important for your readers, listeners out there, I hope you'll consider subscribing.
Yeah, it's a great Substack. I certainly highly recommend it. We really appreciate you talking with us today.
Great. Thanks for having me. I appreciate the invitation.
We'd like to thank Radley again for taking the time to talk with us today. Radley's Substack, The Watch, is a great resource which highlights concerns about the criminal justice system. It is well worth checking out.
Please check out his book, The Cadaver King and the Country Dentist, a true story of injustice in the American South. Today, we'll include a link in our show notes.
Thanks so much for listening to The Murder Sheet. If you have a tip concerning one of the cases we cover, please email us at murdersheet@gmail.com. If you have actionable information about an unsolved crime, please report it to the appropriate authorities.
If you're interested in joining our Patreon, that's available at www.patreon.com/murdersheet. If you want to tip us a bit of money for records requests, you can do so at www.buymeacoffee.com/murdersheet. We very much appreciate any support.
Special thanks to Kevin Tyler Greenlee, who composed the music for the Murder Sheet, and who you can find on the web at kevintg.com.
If you're looking to talk with other listeners about a case we've covered, you can join the Murder Sheet discussion group on Facebook. We mostly focus our time on research and reporting, so we're not on social media much. We do try to check our email account, but we ask for patience as we often receive a lot of messages. Thanks again for listening.